A warm welcome to everybody present already. We will wait a moment and start soon. Thank you for your patience. Good afternoon. Before we start the online event, we want to provide some technical information. This online event will be held in English and French with simultaneous interpretation. In order to listen to the English interpretation, do the following. Go with your mouse to the taskbar and click on the symbol globe. Now you can choose either English or French or original sound. In case you choose the original sound, you will listen to the speakers in the language they speak. Fatou?
Merci Andreas. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. Avant de commencer l'événement en ligne,
Thank you, Andreas. Before we start, we would like to provide you with a few technical items. This online conference in English and French will be interpreted simultaneously. In order to listen to the English translation, please do click on
sur votre souris dans la barre des tâches et cliquez sur le
the
symbole.
small globe and then choose the language you wish to listen to, English or French, or the original sound. If you select original sound, you will listen to the various languages spoken by the moderator and presenters.
Finally, welcome again to our online event, Externalizing EU Borders, Frontex and other European security actors in West Africa. Welcome to all the participants and especially to our wonderful speakers, whom I ask to switch on their cameras so that we can see you in the beginning all. My name is Andreas. I work as field officer for migration at the Berlin-based NGO Brot für die Welt, Bread for the World. And many of our partners in the global south are negatively affected by externalization policies of the EU. And at the same time, they are fighting against these practices. One of them is Mokhtar Ndiaye from Alam from Sahara, who will speak later this afternoon. And I'm very honored to co-host the event today with Fatou Faye, who is sitting in Dakar. Fatou?
Voilà. Ce travail n'a pas seulement été effectué avec ceux qui sont là, mais surtout avec l'organisation.
Various people have contributed to this conference, Bread for the World, Migrations Control Info, and collectively joined with the third round of organizers, as well as Migration Control, and other activists, journalists, translators, researchers, and anti-racism organizations from Europe and Africa, working on this externalization of border control. My name is Fatou, and I am program officer at the RLS office in West Africa. We work together with various organizations, activists, and researchers who work towards protecting migrants' rights.
I'll do a very brief introduction and also speak about the schedule of today. So we are holding this event in very challenging times, I would say. Looking at the media, the EU threatens to become a single issue institution. And its only goal seems to be stop migration towards Europe, and by doing so, denying people on the move even the most fundamental rights. And we are witnessing this strategy not only at the external borders, but the EU is also stepping up its efforts to cooperate with neighboring countries so that they become reliable outposts of the Fortress Europe. And we call this externalization. The recent deal with Tunisia is an example for that, an example that has been and is still very controversially discussed. Our event today focuses on another form of externalization, that has not got so much public attention so far. We will focus on the activities of Frontex and other European security actors that try to control and stop migration in non-European countries. Although there are very valuable reports and articles tackling this issue, we have the feeling that most of us still lack a proper overview about questions such as where are Frontex and other European security actors deployed in third countries? What is exactly their mandate and what are they doing? We will tackle these questions today, focusing on a specific region, West Africa. We have chosen this regional focus because on the one hand, 2 of the 3 organizations that are organizing the event this evening, they have a focus on West Africa or are even based there. On the other hand, Frontex itself has focused on the region in the last years, and the EU also wants 2 West African states, Mauritania and Senegal, to sign status agreements with Frontex. When we planned this event, we had 3 goals in mind. First, to provide general information on this type of externalization. Second, to shed lights on the effects of these activities in specific countries. And third, to discuss strategies how we can critically engage with this form of externalization. And for this task, we have invited activists, academics, and politicians from both West Africa and Europe to provide us with inputs, and you can all see them here now. And we are really very thankful that all of you have accepted the invitation. Before I pass over to you, let's have a very brief look on the agenda. So I'll try to share my screen. Yeah, so the introduction that's now, then as an important starting point for our discussion, we will have inputs by Mariana Gliati and Jane Kilpatrick. They will provide us with a general overview. Which European security actors are controlling migration in West Africa? What is their exact mandate? And what do we know specifically on the role of Frontex? Afterwards, Leonie Jekken and Hassan Mokhtar will shed light on 2 specific country contexts, Mauritania and Senegal. As I mentioned before, it is these 2 countries that the EU wants to sign status agreements with Frontex. And this would intensify already existing forms of cooperation in controlling migration in and from these 2 countries. After these 2 deep dives, we will discuss with Tineke Strick from the European Parliament. What possibilities does the European Parliament have to control and perhaps also to stop the activities of Frontex and other European security actors in West Africa? And how does she assess them from a human rights perspective? The last 2 inputs come from 2 activists, Mokhtar Danyaye from Niger and Saliou Diouf from Senegal. Saliou just organized an anti-Frontex conference in Dakar and will speak about how civil society in Senegal is confronting Frontex. And Mokhtar will do the same for Niger, but of course will also tackle the recent coup d'etat in Niger and how it might change the migration regime in the country. After these inputs, the speakers will react on your comments and questions. Unfortunately, no direct intervention will be possible, but we encourage you to post your comments in the chat. If you have questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A tool, and please also indicate to whom you direct the question. We will collect your comments and questions and forward them to the speakers, and please be respectful in your posts. We will not tolerate any offensive posts, any racist or sexist comments. So on the last technical note, we will also we record this event so that other people will also have the chance to watch it later on. So then I think we are prepared now to start, and let's start with the first inputs of Mariana and Jane, who will do a kind of mapping of the activities of Frontex and other European security actors targeting migration in West Africa. Mariana Gliati, she's working on the Tilburg University and holds a PhD from Leiden University. She has published widely on the subject of our discussion today, so on Frontex and also its role in externalization and the European migration regime to West Africa. And she has published academic articles as well as reports for the Libe Committee of the European Parliament or State Watch. And much of this work has been the result of a very productive cooperation with our second speaker, Jane Kilpatrick. Jane was a researcher at the State Watch for 3.5 years, where she looked into the mandate, action, and accountability of Frontex in different contexts. And other fields of her research include torture and anti-torture policies. We asked Mariana and Jane to focus their input on the following questions. Which European security actors are part of EU's externalization strategy in West Africa? What do they exactly do there? What is their mandate? And what is also the legal base for their work? So Mariana, I think you will start. The word is yours. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all very much for the invitation. I hope you can hear me all right. Jane will be sharing the slides. Jane, if you could also go on full screen for the slides. Perfect. So I'd like to start by saying that even saying that border externalization has a detrimental impact upon human rights has become such a commonplace statement, a sort of ordinary remark. Still, the EU continues and escalates the closed borders policy, including outsourcing border management to non-EU countries, especially in Africa. And from this, multi-actor forms of cooperation emerge, which include state and non-state actors. Now, existing research, especially legal research, primarily focuses on border externalization in the Maghreb, while West Africa, we also heard it from Andreas earlier, is greatly neglected in comparison. This is why we're most happy with this gathering today. And it's most neglected if we take into account how crucial the region is, including many important transit and refugee-producing countries, top development aid recipients. Amongst the 5 priority countries for the EU Security Migration Development Cooperation, we have 4 West African countries, so 4 out of the 5. Next slide, please. During our research on the work of Frontex in Mali and Niger, and Jane will tell you more about it in a bit, we also tried to map out the relevant Western actors that are active in the region, or at least that was our intention, but this proved to be a rather impossible task. The stakeholders themselves seem to not have a good overview, and the playfield seemed to be constantly shifting. So no one had up-to-date information on who was on the ground, not to mention the labyrinth that is the funding allocation in this area. So the best we can do today is provide you with an incomplete indication of the plethora of the different actors that are involved in West Africa, constituting the migration security nexus in border management. Now, we speak of this nexus because the different border management activities are often difficult to distinguish. Take, for example, the mandate of EUCAP Sahel, which is initially focusing on counterterrorism and organized crime, and has now been extended to the management of the borders, including migration movement. And I mentioned before that the playfield has been constantly changing. West Africa remains an extremely volatile region. Many Western actors have left Mali after the last coup d'etat. ECOWAS is now threatening military intervention in Niger. The public sentiment is becoming increasingly anti-Western, or at least anti-French. Next slide. France has 1,500 troops in Niger, supported by drones and planes. It has had counterinsurgency troops in West Africa, actually, for the last decade. But as a result of the military coups in Mali in 2021 and Burkina Faso in 2022, it retracted its troops from these countries and collected the bulk of its forces to Niger. Trying to combat the anti-French sentiment there as well, France had already started before even the coup in Niger, moving towards less Western boots on the ground and rather focusing on supporting local forces. Now, This summer, the military junta in Niger revoked its military agreements with France and ordered the French ambassador to leave. The ambassador finally returned to France at the end of September, and France announced a few days ago that the end of its cooperation with Niger and military presence there will be withdrawn. Actually, it has already started. It announced the removal of its soldiers by the end of the year. And this marks the end of an era, actually, for France's military intervention in its former colonies. According to the latest information that I have, France still maintains military bases in Chad, and that is its last military base in the Sahel, in Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Gabon. And the tendency is again to focus on co-managing operations with local forces. Next slide. Spain has also significant influence in joint investigation teams. Spanish and French police have worked together with Nigerian police in combating smuggling and trafficking. The Spanish Guardia Civil is implementing transnational coordinated border control projects and infrastructures in North and West Africa, including the Seahorse projects, which are interregional cooperation projects, including operational cooperation stemming from the global approach to migration. And we also have the Garci Sahel program aiming to guarantee stability and the fight against terrorism and organized crime in the Sahel. That project is directed by the Guardia Civil, but also involves the French National Gendarmerie, the Italian Police Force, and the Republican National Guard of Portugal. And I mentioned Italy. When we were conducting our research in Niger, we also heard of Italian police, and it turns out that Italy indeed had 300 soldiers in Niger before the coup. Last August, Italy announced that 65 of its soldiers had left Niger, and the rest deployed remain for counterinsurgency and military training missions. Next slide, please. Germany has been active in Mali in the context of the UN peacekeeping mission MINUSMA, but has, as of the end of September, also been withdrawing its troops from Mali, and it's unclear to me if some of the troops will stay. We have the German Agency for International Cooperation, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, that works with African states in the area of migration governance. For example, GIS has had an office in Niger's capital in Niamey since 1968. And following the coup in July, all bilateral development cooperation with Niger was suspended. Germany also has migration and border management liaison offices in Niamey and police offices at EU Cap Sahel Niger. The US also operates 2 bases in Niger, and they also have established a separate US High Command for the African continent, AFRICOM, that is based in Stuttgart. Next slide, please. We also have larger international missions. MINUSMA is the most well-known one. The peace mission in Mali, it began in 2013 and grew out of a French military intervention, and now has risen to the most important peacekeeping mission in the area. You can see, thank you, Andreas, you can see the rest of the missions there. The EU is, of course, implementing various forms of operational cooperation through the Migration Partnership Framework. We also have, there is enhanced cooperation, return readmission. EU development aid is also used for migration control purposes. In the Migration Pact, the EU affirmed its intention to intensify cooperation with third countries. Frontex there would have a central role. We also have several CSDP missions, Common Security and Defense Policy, such as EU Cap Sahel in Niger and EU Cap Sahel Mali, since 2012 and 2015 accordingly. And last August, the Council adopted a decision on a European Union Security and Defense Initiative in support of West African countries in the Gulf of Guinea. And as part of this, a new Common Security Defense Policy mission is planned to be deployed in Benin and Ghana, and possibly also expanded in other West African states. Next slides. We also have if you could go to the next slide. This is a bit of an overview of other forms of cooperation, such as bilateral agreements, Spanish investments in Mali, Guinea, the Gambia and Ivory Coast, or the emergency transit mechanism from 2017 that focused on evacuating migrants from detention centers in Libya to Niger. And then, of course, we have the return partnership. The EU seeks partnership with Nigeria with respect to return and readmission, but Nigeria, which also has a large diaspora community in Europe, has been resisting formal agreement for years. In the next slide, you'll see an overview of agreements that Nigeria also already has bilateral agreements. And of course, we have involvement of the IOM with several projects, including return and development cooperation. If you would like to go to the last slide, I would like to stop by pointing out that the discontent with Western partners is growing and also France's influence is declining. As this happens, China is gradually becoming a more attractive partner, and China-Africa security military cooperation is growing, and China has concrete also aspirations for larger global governance, which also includes a China-Africa peace and security policy. Russia has been partnering up with Africa since 2015, have several military agreements, and the Wagner Group is active in the area as well. And in this picture, you can see also Russian flags flown during the march of supporters in the coup last July, indicative of the appeal of Russia as a security partner. I will hand over to Jane.
Thank you. Yes, so I'll talk a little bit more about the research that we've been undertaking and how we've focused. Our research, supported by the Transnational Institute and Statewatch, considers the externalization of the EU's borders via the work of Frontex, focusing on the case studies of Mali and Niger. We worked, I think it's important to say, also with a team of researchers who conducted interviews. So we also worked with, and are still working with Niv Nivrin at the Transnational Institute, and with Rumo Chiluta, Amami Sila, Katia Gir, and Oriol Puig. And since we've conducted our interviews and our desk analysis, our analysis is focused on human rights accountability and the continuation of colonial dynamics by European actors in the region. So we consider differing political priorities, including the ECOWAS free movement zone, as well as economic goals such as the impact of remittances versus, for example, European development aid. Yep. So to give a brief background of Frontex and its work outside the EU, just a very brief overview of the agency. It was founded in 2004 as an agency. Sorry, I have
nothing. Please continue.
Founded in 2004 as an agency to coordinate the border management activities of EU member states. Since then, it's had 4 expansions of its mandate, giving it greater powers with further reach, and it's also become the EU's most highly funded agency. Its annual budget for last year was 754 million euros. In terms of its activities outside the EU's borders, before this became part of the agency's governing regulation, Frontex did work with states outside the EU, but only under the direction of an EU member state which had a bilateral agreement with another state. So, for example, this was the case with Senegal and Mauritania's participation in the Frontex coordinated Operation Hera, which launched in 2006. But it was the 2011 amendment to the Frontex regulation which introduced more direct cooperation. A new regulation in 2016 gave Frontex the competence to launch operations under status agreements in non-EU states, as long as they shared a border with an EU state. And this option led to the signing of status agreements between the EU and Western Balkan states, under which Frontex has launched border surveillance, land and sea operations. And it was another new regulation in 2019 that expanded the possibility of conducting operations outside the EU to any state, anywhere in the world. So besides joint operations under status agreements, the agency may also launch and finance technical assistance projects in countries outside the EU and provide other operational and technical assistance relevant to returns. It can deploy its statutory staff and other experts, such as liaison officers there, and exchange information with non-EU countries in the framework of Eurosur and risk analysis networks. So looking more specifically at Frontex's activities in West Africa, this has increased alongside EU concern about the potential impact of security risks on potential migration towards its own external borders. So Frontex's activities in intelligence gathering, relationship and capacity building across North and West African regions has also been seen to spread in this time scale. Specifically in 2010, Frontex launched the Africa Frontex Intelligence Community, or AFIC, to facilitate capacity building, cooperation on deportations from the EU, and information exchange on migrant smuggling, cross-border crime, and modus operandi and risk analysis. Central elements of the AFIC network are the risk analysis cells, which are offices run by partner states' border management authorities, but with equipment, training, and the setting up of integrated border management systems provided by Frontex. So, sorry, just checking which slide I'm on. Yeah, so the agency's growing commitment to establishing a presence in multiple countries, concluding working agreements with EU missions alongside the Pact on Asylum and Migration, published first in 2020, these indicate a much more operational plan for the future. So, for example, the scoping missions conducted in 2022 by Frontex in Senegal and Mauritania have led to the authorization by the Council to open negotiations on status agreements that we'll hear a lot more about in the future sessions. So I probably don't have time to go too much over all of the legal criticisms that we have developed in our analysis, but I think specifically to Frontex, these, so I think we'll probably discuss much more its role in externalized border management. So perhaps, yeah, for now, I'll focus more on the Frontex concerns around how its growing mandate and resources are not matched, for example, with the full staffing of the Fundamental Rights Office, the full involvement of the Fundamental Rights Officer in plans and operational plans outside of the EU, and more concerningly, examples that the Fundamental Rights Office and the Consultative Forum have been ignored by planning, ongoing issues with transparency at Frontex, specifically that residents and citizens of countries outside the EU don't have the same rights to access documents as citizens of the EU, and the legal immunity proposed under status agreements. So yeah, I will leave the rest perhaps for the Q&A, as I think we are well out of time. But there will also be more detail coming up in an upcoming article in the Movements Journal, and our research report with Transnational Institute and State Watch should be published pretty soon, and we'll have a lot more detail in there. So yeah, looking forward to the session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jane and Mariana. This was a good start for our discussion. The interpreters asked me to tell all the speakers to speak a bit slower, otherwise interpretation is really hard to do. And then I hand over to Fatou and the next speakers. Fatou.
Merci Andreas et merci à Jane et Mariana pour ces brillantes
Thank you to Mariana and Jane for their input. I will now introduce Leonie, who is doing her PhD in Amsterdam and had a scholarship from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation until December 2022. She was also an affiliate to the University of Dakar in Senegal. Her research focuses on the intertwined colonial continuities and racial capitalism with the production of migration governance in the context of migration control as dictated internally and externally when it comes to governance against smuggling in Senegal. 8 minutes. I want to underline 8 minutes only. She will share with us the result of her research about the activity of European security actors in the different countries, such as Senegal, and their implications for the people who are migrating and societies as a whole. The floor is yours. Thank you, Fatou. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Fatou. Given the time constraints, I will answer the 3 questions in the most selective but hopefully equally concise manner, drawing on 3 key trends that I discerned throughout my research on EU-Senegalese border work. I will consider the most relevant security actors involved in Senegal by looking at the contested geographical stretching of European border and the institutional deepening of EU-Senegalese border work. Then I turn to the trends on the national level by looking at border work in Senegal as an internationalized field. And I will conclude with some observations on the impacts of EU-funded projects and cooperation. So to turn to the first question, I would zoom into the Senegalese maritime border, where European and Senegalese joint border control have both been ongoing and contested since 2006. In 2006, Senegal was among the first non-EU countries where Frontex became operational through its joint operation HERA, which spanned joint aerial and maritime surveillance of Senegalese territorial waters with the aim of intercepting departures. Operation HERA was stopped in 2019 due to the changed legal framework of the agency in line with its revised 2016 regulation. And this regulation made it necessary to spell out the role and competence of the agency within the mission, in particular in regard to its executive powers. This until then was not the case, as HERA was based on a bilateral agreement between Spain and Senegal. To save the mission, we can deduct from a leaked letter that Frontex proposed to Spain to firstly provide the agency with a bilateral agreement, including the definition of the role of Frontex, as well as an extension of HERA to Spanish territorial waters. These proposals were not accepted by Spain, and the mission ceased to be implemented from 2019 onwards, while the Guardia Civil continues to be present in Senegal. In parallel, EU efforts have been ongoing to conclude a working arrangement with Senegal since 2016, and from 2022, the Commission pushed for the opening of negotiations for a status agreement. And while the previous has illustrated the contested nature of border work at the sea border and the shifting mandate of Frontex, when considering international actors present in Senegal, it is striking that in more recent years, the fight against migrant smuggling has become an increasingly important field of cooperation and framing of border control measures. And you see on the slide a mapping that I did in the beginning of my research stay in Senegal last year, which maps the different projects that are at the intersection of fighting migrant smuggling and border control. And I do not have the time to go in depth on each project, but I will illustrate some of their key results. At the Senegalese Border Police, a division to fight migrant smuggling was founded in 2018, first with French bilateral support and then supported through EU development funding. EU development funding has also financed the building of 7 antennas of this division at border posts across the country, and you see on the slide a photo of one of these construction sites at the border post in Saint-Louis. In the framework of the POC project, which stands for Common Operational Partnership. A Spanish liaison officer is stationed at this police division alongside a French colleague, and their presence is aimed at improving information exchange and day-to-day police cooperation. The POC project has also resulted in joint investigation among Senegalese and Spanish public prosecutors. Several projects have included workshops and trainings towards law enforcement and public prosecutors, and the latter have highlighted interviews I conducted with them that these trainings made them realize the importance of applying strict measures against smugglers. Further, there is an ongoing legal reform process of the Senegalese legal frameworks on smuggling of migrant and trafficking in human beings, carried out with funding from the Netherlands. And in 2018, a high-level regional consultative framework was launched to monitor progress made by West African states on commitments to fight migrant smuggling under the Niamey Conventions. Lastly, a regional project is linking 7 similar national projects to the POC, among them the ECI that Mariana also mentioned in her presentation, to build a joint database for investigative purposes. These projects mirror the increased relevance given by international, European, and West African actors to carry out border work through fighting migrant smuggling, and by doing so, moving border work more and more within the state to also include judicial actors. And this brings me to my second point, that Senegalese border work has become an internationalized field where ideas, logics, and actors travel and exchange with one another. And one striking example is the adoption of the Senegalese strategy against irregular migration. This strategy was adopted earlier this year, and by European and Senegalese actors that I interviewed, it was portrayed as a solely Senegalese initiative. However, many activities of the drafting bodies were funded by European donors. While the policy proposes that what has been termed preventive and restrictive measures, among its many objectives is the building of administrative detention centers at border crossing points. Asking one of the actors involved with the drafting of the strategy why that was a necessity, they responded that this was the same thing Europe had on Lesbos, and hence they would need it as well. And this illustrates how the internationalized field of Senegalese border work has become a field where ideas, logics, actors, as well as financial and material incentives stand in constant interaction. And this observation brings me to my last point, the question, what are the consequences? There is recurrent reports on pullbacks and interception resulting in shipwrecks, both at the hands of the Guardia Civil and the Senegalese Navy. Cooperation, negotiations, and projects in the field of migration control are opaque. Freedom of information requests are censored, like this response I got to freedom of information requests earlier this year, and Senegalese human rights and migration watchdogs have even more limited access to information. And finally, the deployment of technological assets through European projects, including phone data extraction gear, which you see on this photo, bears the risk of enhancing ongoing political oppression of opposition figures. Thank you so much.
Merci Léonie. Merci pour ces belles analyses. Voilà,
Thank you very much for this highly interesting analysis that was very relevant and very impressive. We will now move on to another speaker, Hassanul Mokhtar. He holds a PhD and he is at the moment carrying researches in the field of development.
Dans le domaine du développement international.
Researcher in the field of international development. His research topics are the relationship between migration, border, and development processes, with a regional focus on Mauritania, West African Sahel, and Sahara.
Il s'intéresse en particulier à la manière.
He focuses most of all on the following question: how is the fact that migration is being made illegal, interacting with colonial heritage within contemporaneous processes and ever-changing dynamics of displacement. Hassan will provide us with an overview of the activities of European actors in the field of security in the various countries, as well as the role played by those people or the consequences for those people who are on the move and those societies as a whole, also in Mauritania. Hassan, you have the floor. 8 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fatou, and to everybody for joining. I'm going to keep this very brief, but I'm happy to elaborate upon anything that isn't clear in the Q&A. So I'm going to focus mainly on Spain and the EU, given that Frontex is being covered elsewhere, but I can, as I say, cover a bit of the history of Frontex engagement in Mauritania. So as we're all aware, Mauritania straddles the Maghreb and the region of West Africa, and for this reason is often viewed as a strategic country within the context of externalized migration and border governance. It's often categorized as a transit country, since it's primarily, but not exclusively, non-nationals who've been attempting to reach Europe via its territory. Now, despite the fact that migrations into and out of Mauritania are overwhelmingly regionally oriented, the past 17 years has seen a pretty vast architecture of migration and border control efforts constructed in Mauritania and off its coast, with the explicit aim of reducing these Europe-bound movements. So in what follows, I'm going to very briefly map and outline the main actors involved in this architecture. I'll highlight some key developments in its construction. And in doing so, I'm going to try to draw attention to two primary consequences that I view of this process. Okay, so to just set the scene, in 2006, the Canary Islands saw more than 32,000 arrivals of people from the coast of West Africa onto its shores. And this results in a spate of policy responses at both Spanish and EU level. I'm just going to draw attention to three important responses at the Spanish bilateral level. So first, a readmission agreement that had been signed between Spain and Mauritania in 2003 becomes a crucial tool of response to these arrivals. And crucially, this agreement allows for the deportation from Spain to Mauritania of both Mauritanian nationals and foreign nationals who were judged to have transited through Mauritanian territory to get to Spain. Secondly, the Spanish police and the Spanish Guardia Civil are deployed to the city of Nouadhibou, the northern port city of Nouadhibou in Mauritania, for migration control purposes, and remain deployed there to this day through a range of memoranda of understanding that are signed between Spanish and the Mauritanian security forces. Thirdly, a detention center is constructed by Spanish soldiers in April 2006 in Nouadhibou with funding from the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation and Development. And as a result of all of these measures, the first consequence that I'd like to emphasize is evident, namely a sharp rise in deportations from Mauritanian state territory between 2005 and 2006, and the introduction of the experience of what Nicolas de Geneva calls deportability as a social condition in Mauritania. Okay, so as the arrivals in Spain begin to diminish after these measures are put in place, the EU begins to take on a more direct role in reshaping the migration policy landscape in Mauritania. It does so primarily through a national migration strategy that is adopted in 2010. The idea here being to render the domain of migration management more comprehensive and holistic. In the process, a host of other actors would enter the fold of externalized migration management. And they do so as implementing partners of various projects that are envisioned in the National Migration Strategy. So these organizations include ones we've already heard about, parastatal organizations like the GIZ or FIAP, international organizations like the IOM, the UNHCR, as well as states like Germany, Spain, and Japan, curiously enough. Now, very importantly, at this moment in time, the Mauritanian state's role in upholding the external policy prerogative of policing irregular migration also becomes central at this time. This happens primarily with the introduction of a new biometric residence permit for foreign nationals that is introduced in 2012. This is soon followed by regular patrols and raids in migrant neighborhoods and workplaces in Nouakchott, which is the capital of Mauritania, and in Nouadhibou, with the purpose of implementing this new residence permit decision. So basically, if the policy of policing irregular migration and the associated condition of deportability that comes with it, these are originally external prerogatives. I think that the residence permit in 2012 is how it becomes absorbed within Mauritanian state institutions and security practices. So this all means that by the time the EU Trust Fund for Africa is launched in 2015, there is a relative coherence between Mauritanian state actors and the EU around the newfound problem of policing irregular migration. I'm going to assume that people are familiar with the Trust Fund, but I can explain in the Q&A for those who aren't. So the Trust Fund represents a significant expansion of externalization in both quantitative and qualitative terms in Mauritania. As regards the latter, the migration strategy that I mentioned a moment ago earmarked 12 million worth of migration-related projects over the 6 years of existence. The Trust Fund, on the other hand, financed 84 million worth of projects in 2019 alone. And at the same time, the Trust Fund has also expanded along qualitative lines, beyond migration issues kind of strictly understood, and encompassing more general border security and counter-terror initiatives, like ones that Mariana mentioned a moment ago, Garci Rapid Deployment Units, a support program for the G5 Sahel, which is a regional counterterrorism alliance that was established in 2014, whose permanent secretariat is based in Nouakchott. And it's this qualitative expansion that I would highlight as the second primary consequence of engagement and externalization in the region, namely a merging of migration control concerns with broader counterterrorism and security issues. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up by situating these two consequences within more recent developments in the region. So on the first consequence, last year, the state embarked upon a regularization campaign, removing the fee for residence permits and inviting foreign nationals to obtain it. At the same time, there's been a reported increase in policing of the residence permit, and as a result, a reported significant drop in so-called irregular departures from Mauritanian state territory, meaning that the Mauritanian state is still pretty happy to implement external migration control prerogatives. And thus far, I think that the domestic stakes for the Mauritanian state are relatively low in filling out this role in cooperating with Spain and the EU on this front, since deporting foreign nationals is a pretty uncontroversial activity in terms of domestic politics in Mauritania. Now, this might change in the future, however, as Mauritania is the only country in the G5 Sahel Regional Security Alliance that hasn't seen a coup in recent years, but it has been affected by the wave of instability in the region, and particularly on its eastern border. And this all means, and I'll finish with this, that the Mauritania's strategic significance for the EU has increased significantly as a result of the wave of anti-French and anti-Western sentiment in the region, which means that the regional stakes of fulfilling this role vis-a-vis the EU may have heightened domestically, but at the same time, its bargaining power and leverage has increased vis-a-vis the EU as well. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Merci, Mokhtar. Merci bien. Autant pour moi, Hassan, merci bien.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I now give the floor to Andreas. Andreas?
Andreas, turn your mic.
Sorry, my microphone was switched off. So thank you very much, Leonie and Hassan, for providing these insights on Senegal and Mauritania. Our next speaker has traveled to both countries this year. As a member of the European Parliament, her aim was to better understand the dynamics, the designing of a status agreement between Frontex and the two countries could unfold. She's one of the public figures in Europe that has been critically engaging with the externalization dynamics of the EU the most, I would say, both as a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs for the Green Party in the European Parliament, as well as an academic researcher and professor for citizenship and migration law at the Faculty of Law of Radboud University in the Netherlands. Of course, I'm talking about Tineke Strik. Tineke, thank you for being here with us today. We have already heard a lot about how Frontex is expanding its area of operation to West Africa. As a consequence, is the European Parliament also expanding its work? So what possibility do you have to control these activities in West Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Andreas, also for organizing this very insightful event. Yes, we try to get more grip on Frontex extraterritorial activities. And Jane was just also explaining the working arrangements that have been made, and also the AFIC, which actually the AFIC only concerns already 30 countries in the West Africa. These types of cooperation, Frontex has a lot of autonomy in that, and that makes it very difficult for us to really exercise adequate control. The forms of cooperation where we have most possibilities on is status agreements, because it is an international agreement. Until now, we only have these status agreements with European countries. So in the Western Balkans, Moldova. But this is for the first time that the Commission asked the Council to start negotiations with Mauritania and Senegal, so with African countries. When I saw that happening, I thought we really need to be much more on top of that, because it will have a lot of more human rights implications. We already noticed with the states agreement with Western Balkan countries, it's very difficult to do something more than only say yes or no in the end. So I proposed that we would make, because normally it's an international agreement, so we have the right to consent, but that's only at the very last stage of the negotiations. Well, at the same time, the Parliament has the right to be informed at any stage of the negotiations. That's in Article 218 of the treaty of the TFEU. And I wanted to make sure that the European Parliament would also be in a position to come up with concerns, recommendations, give input to the negotiators, because until now, only the Council is giving a mandate. So we propose to make an own initiative report. And I'm rapporteur for Mauritania. Cornelia Ernst from the left is from Senegal. And this is why the two of us, we went for a working visit. We are now drafting our report, and it's negotiated. So we hope that in this way, on the one hand, we have informed the European Parliament much better, but hopefully also for the first time to have some more input in the negotiations with those countries.
Okay, thank you, Tineke. I mean, now a question to you as a parliamentarian, but also a professor of law. If we look at the activities of Frontex and a possible status agreement, how do you assess these activities and these plans from a human rights perspective?
Yeah, if you look at the difference between such a states agreement with a European country, which is a candidate member state and which also a member of the Council of Europe, you see, although you still must be very alert, of course, on what's happening there, but there's much more alignment with the human rights safeguards in those countries. If you start negotiating with an African country, you have a completely different legal framework. So that's already the first problem you have to deal with, because Frontex, in every operational action, it works under the instruction, under the command of the border authorities of that host country. So that will for sure create many more tensions if there's a completely different national legislation and different international legislation. And this is more the theoretical part, but when I went to Mauritania, I also saw a lot of deficiencies in those safeguards. UNHCR and IOM told us also that, you know, after disembarkations, they have now finally got a kind of procedure to be able to identify people and also people's need for protection. But there are many raids going on, so very arbitrary apprehensions. Those people are put for a very short time in detention and then expelled to the border or with Mali or with Senegal. So there's no one in the possibility to check if they are in need for protection or access to an asylum procedure. There's also still the slavery model, not formally, but in practice, it's very much still there. So there's a lot of discrimination. And also Human Rights Watch and Amnesty wrote a lot of extensively about the human rights violations systematically going on. There's no proper asylum system. So you cannot imagine how Frontex would act there and then still stay in compliance with the fundamental rights of the EU. I mean, if they have intercepted people and they, you know, they are instructed to send them back to the territory, or maybe if they start working on the land border with the desert in the direction of Morocco, there's even no asylum system that they can refer people to. Yeah, people are really exposed to arbitrariness. And I cannot imagine how Frontex could, could guarantee any compliance with fundamental rights in such a situation.
Okay, thank you, Tineke. Let us try to look into the future a bit. I mean, we are witnessing quite different developments at the same time. So the EU pushes for more externalization. The European Parliament, you're quite critical about that. But also the new executive director of Frontex, he raised recently some doubts about future deployments of Frontex in the region. And then we also have the coups d'etat in 3 West African countries that might also change the cooperation model or cooperation per se. So what do you think, how will the activities of Frontex and other security actors evolve in West Africa, and what must be done not only to witness these developments, but also to actively shape them?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. Indeed, the externalization will continue and will be further increased. You see it clearly. This is the objective of the EU. They don't manage to find equal responsibility sharing among themselves. So deterring and outsourcing is their main objective. And well, recently we also saw it with Tunisia, where everyone agreed to outsource the protection despite the huge fundamental rights concerns going on in that country. You also see that von der Leyen has taken more and more the lead in that. She is now reporting to the European Council periodically on all the things that she's doing in that direction. And one of the things she's also mentioning there is to make more use of Frontex also in the cooperation with Tunisia, for instance, by making more aerial surveillance above Tunisia, by using satellite images, etc., etc. So it's indeed true what you said, that the executive director and also the FRO and even the commission, actually, they expressed some, a lot of doubts as to could it work actually to have boots on the ground, to be operational in those countries. So it might very well be the case that they will not start this real physical deployment, also in order to prevent their own accountability problems, because once you're there physically, you have more responsibility. But I do think that in exchange for that, the increase on data sharing, on remote assistance, on funding, will become more and more the type of cooperation. And you also see it already with Libya, for instance, where it has a huge impact on the human rights of people. If the Libyan Coast Guard, and that will definitely also be the same for the Tunisian Coast Guard, will be informed by Frontex, despite it's not a safe port, then people will be intercepted and brought back there. And it's a kind of, you know, they do border control by proxy. And I think in the beginning, indeed, they thought, okay, if we put the agency instead of our own officials, we may, you know, we may escape our accountability. But now more and more, I think they see the problematic issues of that. And unfortunately, they have a lot of more possibilities to make sure that those member states, you know, comply with what the EU wants. They are funded by it. In many cases, there hardly any monitoring. Yeah, I come to that. How are we going to monitor? We push the Commission and Frontex, of course, to monitor very much better, and also to make sure that Frontex has access to all the spots where it has a joint operation. But I think more and more that we should not be dependent on what the Commission is doing, because they don't have interest in doing a transparent monitoring. So I think also with this event, for instance, we really need to build networks with NGOs, with experts on the ground, so that we know ourselves better what's going on and how we could, you know, when we should call for suspension, or how we could make sure that that we can exercise our effective control. One last remark I just heard also from the others, that getting access to documents is really a huge problem in order to get insight into what's happening. For us, it's a bit the same. I also, you know, counter that problems. And also in that sense, I think we should do much more within the parliament to make sure that we get the information we want, but we also want to make it publicly accessible so that everyone can follow it, and we can have a thorough public scrutiny and public debate about this as well. And I also hope in that regard, we will continue our cooperation with civil society experts and everyone working in this field.
Thank you so much, very much, Tineke, for giving some insights how the European Parliament is trying to follow and to control externalization strategies of Frontex and co. And thank you also for pointing out the necessity to cooperate more closely with activists, academics, etc., in the affected countries. We will now go to two of these activists, and I'll pass over to Fatou again. Fatou.
Merci Tineke, merci Andrea.
Thank you, Tineke. Thank you, Andreas. As Andreas suggested, in this second part, we will hand over to activists, and we will start with the negotiation part between Senegal and Frontex, in order to also get an insight from civil society. We have the honor to count amongst us Saliou Bounouf, who is a senior technician in electromechanics and naval mechanics, who became an activist in 2015 by becoming a member of the transnational network Watch the Med alarm phone, a network that helps people out at sea and in distress on the Mediterranean. 5 years later, he came back to Senegal in 2019 to create the NGO Beaux Affaires. And the aim is to fight for the freedom of people, of each and every person. And in 2021, he set up a regional team, Bozafi, for the alarm phone Western Med, that is called AP Dakar, Alarm Phone Dakar. Salut. The question we've got for you today: how do people view the role of Frontex and other similar actors in your country? So how is it discussed? And what should we do in the future? Salut, you've got 7 minutes. The floor is yours in order to share your impressions on that question. Salut, are you with us? Can you hear us? Hello, my name is Salut. I founded the NGOs mentioned previously, and I'm a member of the Alarm Phone Network. I'm based here in Dakar, and with Bouzafi, we work on questions of migration and policy when it comes to migration in Senegal. The question? So the sound is difficult. The interpreter is doing her best. So people are starting to hear about Frontex. So we've got negotiations and we don't really talk about what is going on, about what this actually means. There's very little communication, very little information being made accessible. I think that also makes it difficult for us to become active and to fight. So people don't feel like they can discuss topics they're not sufficiently informed about, and that makes it all very tricky. With Bouzafi, we are working with activists and volunteers working around the questions related to migration and the externalization of borders. So we have an idea of what is going on in Senegal with Frontex. People always say Frontex has not been deployed to Senegal, but people like us who can analyze the situation at the borders really observe that there is a presence. And so even if it might not be direct, it's an indirect deployment. And all we have to work on is our analysis, is what we can observe in the country. So we created some initiatives in 2021. We created a network concerning the fight against the externalization of borders. We have the initiative Ushmak Frontex. And we launched something else that just finished. And what is important is for all of us to work hand in hand and to share our experience in order for people to access information so that we can face Frontex, so that we've got information about the risk that Frontex could be for Senegal, relating to fishing, for instance, and the agreements with neighboring countries, and the restriction of our freedom of movement. It's not necessarily directly related to Frontex, So, but it is all funded by the EU. So the presence of the Guardia Civil is very visible in Senegal. 2 or 3 times I went to the airport and I saw European agents requiring to see my passport, asking me what I was going to do abroad. So all of this is a form of restriction of our mobility and the freedom of movement of the people in Senegal. So what I can say concerning what we should do is share information. People need access to information. That's what we need to tackle and get together to discuss the situation, because ever since we have had the pushback against Frontex, we've had many restrictions. There were restrictions, so the Facebook page of Bozafi was taken down or suspended. We were also supposed to negotiate with Medico, and all our visa requests were refused. All I was told is I couldn't travel to the Schengen space and for security reasons. I don't have any record when it comes to any legal problematic activity. So I don't see why my visa was turned down. So what I'm trying to say,
Well, this year we are trying to stage another event, and I think that from then on, it's important that we be certain that this fight aims at abolishing completely this alliance with the Frontex, as we saw. And I will stop there. And I remain available to answer any question. Thank you very much.
Merci bien, Saliou.
Well, thank you very much, Saliou. Thank you very much. The interpreters ask you very kindly to maybe turn off the ventilator, because we can very clearly hear the sound
Merci bien,
of the
Saliou.
wind. And in order to improve the quality of translation, it would be good to get rid of the sound. Well, Nigeria is one of the Western African countries that is the strongest hit by the developments of migration situation. And it is my great pleasure to welcome here Mokhtar Danyai, who's talking to us. He's in Lampedusa. He is founding member of the organization Alam Fansara, committed to rescuing migrants pushed back to the Sahara from Algeria, and he's also working on documenting violence towards migrants in Nigeria. Mokhtar, welcome. Such a great pleasure to meet you again. We have 2 questions to you. First of all, what is the situation in Niger after the coup? Does it have an impact on the migrant situation in the country? You have 4 minutes to answer that question. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Fatou. Very pleased to see you again too, and my warm thanks extend to all organizations who took part of this very important event. Gathering researchers, MPs, and activists from the field. Before answering your question, I'd like to add up to the explanation from Sahara. Well, this organization, Alfam Sahara, is committed to rescuing people who are pushed back from Algeria, expelled from Algeria, pulled back, and also, and most of all, to the Sahara Desert. And as you said, documenting human rights violations, but also documenting losses, death cases is very relevant as far as it's until now rather unknown by the international organizations. Well, let's move on to our situation. 4 minutes. It's not an easy task, but I'll try to be concise and brief. Well, since the 26th of July, the coup that is not the first in the sub-region and probably not the last coup, but that has been extensively covered by the media, had an extensive media coverage due to the fact that Niger holds lots of resources, mining resources, and also has a strategic geographic situation regarding migration control. And this has an impact as far as there has been strong media coverage on the coup in Niger, but one thing is not being told about, which is that international policies and the European Union are strongly interested in the case of Nigeria and very much afraid of losing allies that helps them stopping people on their way towards the north. Yes, we've been talking about externalization of European borders and also externalizing human rights violations. And this area in Nigeria, human rights are being violated, and all this adds up to a very strong frustration among the population that ends into a coup. So there is a direct link, even if it's difficult to prove it. Well, the current situation is a hard and difficult one for the local population, with a very emotional reaction from the ECOWAS, and that sanctions the population in Nigeria. We see a very strong inflation and the price of basic products, and also the financial sanctions do stop the influx of money, because Niger is highly depending on development aid and also support to migrants and to those people who are being stopped. So this has very harsh consequences because the money cannot get into the country. And so there is an increasing amount of migrants entering the country because Algeria constantly pulls back people and deports people to Nigeria.
Il y a eu plusieurs fois et jusqu'à aujourd'hui, c'est sur la table.
Also, since last Thursday, and those sanctions target the state of Nigeria, has a traumatic impact onto the local population, but also onto the migrating population, the people that are on the move, escaping from countries and places, and also afraid that the country might be the target of an attack overnight. And to conclude, I would say that those populations that are on the move, as well as those residing in Niger, are strongly affected. This is a situation that is poorly known, hardly known. Well, thank you, Mokhtar, for this very interesting development. There is a second question about Frontex development. Would like to ask you about the cooperation between Frontex and other European players in the field of security prior to the coup. This cooperation, is it to remain the same, or is it likely to change after the coup? How do you assess the situation? Well, thank you very much indeed. Frontex, as you said, and the recent agreement, the agreements and the recent developments of the agreements between Frontex and Sahel,
de Frontex, avec le régime partant en juillet 2021.
UGAP, July 22, dated July 22, but also other agreements we haven't been informed about. Well, how do we assess them? How are they supposed to develop? It's not only about freedom of movement, then, which is a topic addressed by civil society. Well, I think there is a risk that the troops that are not recognized, the military that is not acknowledged by the international community so far, might use their privilege of being in a country of a strategic importance to the European community in order to further negotiate and, as the previous speaker said, ask for foreign troops to leave the country, that are Italian and German soldiers among us, others. So we don't know exactly what the trend is, but we fear this might be used from all sides. We are mostly worried about the right to free movement, and we see that national authorities, national powers, and the international community are not solely interested in protecting human rights. The European Union wants, first and foremost, to block the way towards the north and towards the European Union. And even if this includes cooperating with states such as Tunisia and other that do breach human rights. So this is what we fear. We will look at the situation, wait and see, and therefore it is even more important that we remain informed about the developments at political level within Europe, among the researchers and among the activists on the field, so that people may enjoy their freedom of movement, and Frontex, that is a means of blocking and restricting the people's freedom of movement, may be controlled. At the moment, within Alam Fon Sahara, we have lodged a complaint at the ECOWAS court that hasn't been received because due to the coup, everything is on hold at the moment.
Merci, Mokhtar. Merci pour cette belle présentation et merci
Thank you,
Salou.
Mokhtar, for this input, and thank you, Salu, for this presentation. I'll hand over to Andreas with the rest of the program.
Thank you, Fatou, and thank you, Mokhtar. I kindly ask all the speakers now to switch on their cameras again as we are coming to the Q&A part. Well, this was a tour de force. We have got so much information about very different phases of the externalization policies and practices. So data collection, data sharing is one example, but building border posts another one, and the deployment even of security forces in West Africa. We got some questions, and I will direct them to the speakers. Please be very brief because we only have half an hour left. So Tina K, there were two questions coming to you. One was on the informality of agreements. So the question was, does the European Parliament has a mechanism to effectively monitor informal agreements like readmission agreements, or can the European Parliament don't do anything about that? And the second question is from Ignatius Mandu from Nigeria. He said that many NGOs in Nigeria working on migration, that they are cooperating with IOM, which is an externalization actor itself. So how is it possible for local NGOs to collaborate with you? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. Yes, informal cooperation really makes it even more difficult for us to scrutinize what's going on. This is why 2 years ago, the European Parliament, I wrote a report for the European Parliament and it was adopted, where we called for, on the human rights aspects of external cooperation, we called for human rights impact assessment prior to starting cooperation, transparent monitoring, transparent funding, but also to formalize the cooperation. So in order to make sure there is a democratic and also judicial control, because also courts have really difficulties in scrutinizing informal cooperation. But you see the tendency is very much into more informalization. And I must say, if I look at monitoring such cooperation, it's even hardly done on formal cooperation, because sometimes we get reports from the European Commission where they evaluate how these readmission agreements are being implemented. These are the formal ones, but it's really actually very much limited to how many numbers of people have been readmitted, more the technical aspects. But if you talk about what is the impact regarding fundamental rights, have they been, readmitted in a safe way, what had happened afterwards, the Commission is not interested in it. And for informal agreements, it's even more difficult. So we don't have clear tools. We have to develop our own activities, let's say, so to organize hearings now and then, or to do working visits, but not really formal tools that we can easily use, except for funding. If there is funding involved, we have a financial working group which can ask information from the Commission, etc. But also there, it's more on a very large scale level, like programs, and not specifically into the the more factual implementation of things. So yeah, a lot needs to be improved regarding that. And your other question about IOM, this is a very good question, because IOM is also very operational. It's also for us very challenging and important to monitor how IOM does its job, because it's very much involved in huge projects indeed in third countries. But I would really love to also have NGOs that do the factual implementation of these projects to reach out to us. And I think it would really be great. I mean, I don't think I always try to get other MEPs more enthusiastic and wanting to invest in things. It's not that easy, but I think it would really be very important to go country by country and organize the NGOs, so to really have good hearings in order to get more information on how things really work out in practice on the ground. So for me, I really hope that people will reach out to me, because this information is very useful to do our tasks, but there's not already a kind of format in which it's done by its own. We really need to take action ourselves.
Thank you, Tineke. So on the one hand, we have a lack of information, and at the same time, we have an overload of information because so many things are happening at the same time. So I think what we really lack is a mechanism, as you pointed out, or a platform where we collect this information and also have the resources to then analyze them and get active. I think that's really key. Thank you. The next question I want to raise to Hassan. Hassan, there was a question on Frontex involvement in returns from deportations from Spain and North African countries. What do you know about that?
Okay, thanks for the question. I can't speak to Frontex's activities on that front in the past 3 to 5 years, but in the beginning of Operation Hera, which was the operation that was launched by Frontex in 2006, it kind of expanded from being initially just a deployment on the Canary Islands that was involved in detaining, apprehending migrants who had recently arrived and organizing their deportation to Mauritania, where they would then be deported farther afield. It then kind of expanded outwards, but only for coastal surveillance purposes. So you would have helicopters patrolling the coastline, boats patrolling the seas as well, for the purposes of detention and returning to Mauritanian state territory migrants who had left. That's as direct as it ever got, as far as I can tell. It would only ever be Mauritanian police who physically bus people from either Nouadhibou or Nouakchott to the southern border. It wouldn't ever be, as of yet, a Frontex agent doing it. I would suggest that the outcome is the same, because when you look at the breakdown of the outcomes of the Hera operations, you see that there is a certain amount of money that the operation costs. You see that there were a certain amount of experts who were deployed, and you see that there is a certain amount of boats or planes that are used, and that they list the numbers of migrants who were deported as a result of these operations. So the numbers of people who are deported, even if they're not being physically removed by Frontex officials, these numbers are still viewed as a positive outcome by Frontex. So that's the indirect rather role that I would say that they play in that regard.
Thank you, Hassan. Jane, you want to add on this question?
Yes, I think I can give a small update from the last 3 years, specifically about Frontex coordinated return operations from Spain. So just give me a moment. Sorry, I just moved my spreadsheet. So in 2019, so this is I don't have the information on where in Spain, that we can probably speculate about that. So I have information from 2019 to 2021. So Frontex coordinated the deportation of 146 people from Spain to Mauritania in 2019, 184 in 2020, and 13 in 2021. So that's my most up-to-date information. So that will be about joint return operations, or even national return operations. So it will have been instigated by Spain, perhaps at a suggestion from Frontex, but it will have been Spain's decision, and Frontex will have assisted in the coordination of the flight.
Thank you, Jane. And I mean, perhaps it's common knowledge, but just to add that Frontex is the key actor in the EU to organize voluntary return and deportation. So that's now part of its mandate. And when it comes to voluntary returns in Northern Africa, so the IOM again is a key player because they get money from the European Union to organize this so-called voluntary return. Magda could tell you a lot about this, but I would now pass on to Leonie first. Leonie, there was a question on the data sharing between Senegalese authorities and Frontex. So can you elaborate a bit more on this? What type of data is shared and who collects it, etc. pp.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and also thank you for the question. So I assume, I think, yeah, okay, now I'm back, kind of. So I assume the question is linked to the data sharing that is happening in the framework of the POC program, because that is where I mentioned it. And there you have, as I said in the presentation, police officers stationed at this division. And from what I understood in my research is that it's really like operational cooperation, information exchange that enables and facilitates police-to-police cooperation. And I think in order to enhance this police cooperation, also among West African states, there we have the NetCop program, the NetCop program, where a joint database for investigative purpose is being built up, but that data is not going to be shared between West African and European stakeholders, officially at least, but among West African stakeholders only officially. And other than that, I'm not aware of any data sharing arrangements between Frontex and West African states when it comes to data on migrant smuggling. There's of course the risk analysis cells, but there's more strategic data. So it's more data that would help them analyze the situation. Apologies for my camera. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leonie. It was Luca's question, not mine. Mariana, now we are coming to you. There was a question on the Seahorse project, and if the Seahorse project is operative in Senegal also. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Thank you. I'm afraid I cannot speak specifically about that, and I don't have the details of what is going on the ground regarding these this project. But I can reply to some of the comments that were mentioned earlier. Also, what you said, Andreas, about a platform for exchange, and I see a question also about judicial avenues against Frontex, which was just posted. I will comment on this as well. So first of all, regarding the exchange of information, such a platform would be essential also regarding the lack of transparency that we have been discussing regarding Frontex. And that is even more important when we're talking about victims of human rights violations or activists working on these topics that are situated in third countries, because these people do not have the right to access to documents that Europeans or third country nationals present in the EU have. And this is a very big legal gap that was not covered when the operations of Frontex were extended to third countries. So having such a platform would allow people that are situated in Europe to share that information also with the stakeholders in West African countries. That is what we could do regarding the gap in social accountability. Tineke and her colleagues at the Parliament are working already on the political accountability. And there is also the EU Ombudsman with respect to administrative accountability that is very active. They haven't said anything specific on third countries, but this is an avenue as well that we could pursue. Now, with respect to judicial accountability, this is a very difficult issue, becoming even more difficult when we're talking about third countries. And the reason for that is not only the immunity from prosecution that we have discussed so much. So just to give a little bit of context, the Frontex deployed personnel or personnel that will be deployed in Senegal and Mauritania will be exempted from criminal and civil persecution. But this already comes to link to the overall problem of holding the agency accountable, even when it's operating in the EU. So we have different levels of difficulty that have to do with the multiplicity of actors involved and the division of responsibility. It is also difficult to find a court, because only the Court of Justice of the European Union would be responsible for dealing with accountability, with the judicial accountability of Frontex, and that is not very open to looking at situations of shared responsibility. And we have most recently the first action for damages against Frontex that was dismissed by the Court of Justice. And this is not the only case. However, today, tomorrow, another case, an action of damages is being heard by the Court of Justice, and we'll see what will happen there. But I'm just saying there are steps that are happening. Still, it's very difficult to hold the agency accountable with its operations in the EU, let alone outside the EU. Thank you.
Okay.
And I apologize for the lack of light. It's quite late here in the Netherlands, and they sent us away from our offices, so I had to find another place at the university.
No
that
problem
does not
at
have
all.
light.
Thank you, Mariana. There's a question on colonial continuity in the externalization practices. So I would direct the connected question to Mokhtar and Saliu. So the question is how knowledge production of migration could be fostered among African activists and states to stop the high level of colonial continuity and colonial knowledge production in migration policies. Mokhtar and Saliu, do you want to comment on this question?
Répondre à la question. OK. Si j'ai compris la question sur la production du savoir.
Well, the question was about knowledge production and which role this could play. I would say yes, certainly yes. Knowledge production taking into account the perspective of the people from the south and activists on the field. This knowledge production should not come from the north or from universities. Yet the issue of migration and the movements have to be taken into account in a comprehensive perspective and encompassing various perspectives, as many as possible, because today we see that mostly Europeans are interested in the work on migration issues, wealth production, publications in journals, etc., reflect that. In other words, local population, it's not about their interests, it's about the fact that they're not informed and not made part of it. And therefore, this is indeed an extension of a colonial way of dealing with the issues as far as those problems relevant to the world are being dealt with from a northern perspective. So a good way would be to encompass knowledge production emerging from the global south, and also African country and the global south in general should be actively involved, because at the moment there is a multiple production of knowledge within activist movements that is not being used and valued. Often, media researchers use information and work together with activists, but they do not reflect the viewpoint of activists on the field. So there should be means, or we should use means to grasp and seize their perspectives of those activists on the field, if I understood your question right, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also posted the question in the chat, but you answered it really correctly. Saliu, do you also want to comment on this question? And afterwards, we'll come to nearly to the closing of the event.
Oui, bon, je peux juste ajouter par rapport à ce que Matar a dit. Bon, je pense que
adding to Mokhtar, I could say that it is very important that knowledge is targeted at countries from the global south, because a small community produces knowledge, and it is not easy, of course. In our countries, people have to deal with everyday issues. The situation and sufferings are there. We cannot only be not all of us can be dreamers, but you also need people who adapt and who show interest for the development of the situation in order to find solution to remedy the situation. First of all, of course, we can understand it because we are part of the system, we're not outside of it. The police well, we try to understand the situation. Maybe today we try to create international synergies across countries so that this knowledge production reaches us. But how can we make sure local population show interest for this, and how can we extend the fight in Senegal, for example? Well, probably our lives are different, and we have different perceptions, and we need to find ways to make people aware and draw their attention on those issues, first of all, and ask about how this should work, as we said initially.
Thank you, Saliu. I would hand over now to Fatou, but before that, I just want to thank all the speakers a lot for your inputs and for the discussion. One plan that I'm thinking of is to create a kind of such a platform, but I mean I'm not, yeah. But it's still the idea is evolving. If you're interested, you can contact me. And thank you very much to the interpreters also. You did a really, really great job. And with that, I pass over to Fatou.
Thank you Andreas, et merci à tout le
Well,
monde.
thank you. We thank all of you for the explanations and inputs, and after 2 hours of exchange, we hope the discussions and analysis helped you in the public and the audience to better understand how Frontex and other players do work and play a role in externalizing the border control towards West Africa, and also which consequences and repercussions their actions have on people's movement, freedom of movement, and also how strong the emergency is to defend people's right in the sub-region. We also hoped that all inputs helped you to better understand how vital freedom of movement is for the social survival of those population in West Africa. Many thanks to all speakers and participants for those questions you asked, for those answers you brought, and we hope to share other fruitful exchange sessions in a very close future. Thank you very much for coming here tonight, and we wish you a very nice evening. See you and goodbye.